I had worked for 40 years to buy my dream house, but on the day I was supposed to move in, I discovered that my daughter had already decided who would live there with me. In that very moment, my silence became my greatest strength. My name is Catherine Miller. I'm 64 years old, and I never thought I'd have to tell this story. Now, as I sit on the porch of my small apartment in Portland, Oregon, looking down at the quiet street where I've lived for nearly 30 years, I feel the need to share what happened a few months ago. I've always been an independent, strong woman, my mother taught me. Never to rely on anyone else, to build my own life with hard work and perseverance. For 40 years, I worked at a local garment factory, starting every day at 5 a.m., getting home around 6 p.m., getting home and clowned, and still finding the energy to care for my only daughter, Emily, and later, my two grandchildren, Jacob and Lily. But this story began on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, a day that quickly turned into a nightmare. It was a Tuesday in March. I was holding the keys to my new home, not just any house, but my dream home. For years after long shifts at work, I would drive past that street lined with red maple trees on the outskirts of Salem, looking through the white picket fence and imagining what it would be like to live there. It was a small, country-style house painted pale yellow, with 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a kitchen that looked out onto a backyard with a few old apple trees. Out front, there was a little wooden porch. I had pictured myself sitting there with a cup of coffee in the mornings, reading a book, welcoming friends. After decades of living in cramped apartments, that house represented freedom, peace, and a new beginning. I had saved every penny, worked weekends, sold a few of my mother's old jewelry pieces, and used up my entire retirement fund to make it mine. When I signed the bladed papers, I cried with joy. At 64, I had finally earned a place that was completely my own. Emily seemed happy for me. She and her husband, Daniel, helped me pick furniture and came along for the final walkthroughs. The kids were thrilled to have Grandma's house with a backyard to play in. I planned to move in on Thursday, had already rented the truck, packed my things, and even bought some decorations. Everything was perfect. On Wednesday night, the evening before the move, I made a special dinner to invite the whole family for one last meal in my old apartment. It was during that dinner that my life changed forever. As I was serving dessert, a vanilla pudding I had made with love, Emily cleared her throat and said she had something to discuss. The tone of her voice told me something wasn't right. I knew my daughter better than anyone. Emily began talking about her in-laws, Linda and Robert, who were struggling financially. They had just sold their house to pay medical debts and needed a temporary place to stay. I genuinely felt sorry for them until Emily continued. She said that she and Daniel had decided that his parents, Linda and Robert, along with his recently divorced sister Megan, Emily went on, explaining how they'd divide the bedrooms. I would take the master, and the other 2 would go to her in-laws and Megan. I tried to speak, but Emily cut me off, saying everything was already arranged, that it would only be temporary, and that Megan would help me around the house. "It'll be good for you, Mom. You'll have company." Daniel sat there quietly, nodding in agreement. The kids were still happily eating their pudding, unaware of the storm brewing, while I sat there, numb like I'd been punched in the chest. How could they decide something so personal without even asking me? That house was the result of my entire life's work, my sweat, my tears, my dream. What hurt most was Emily's calmness, as if I were a stranger in my own life, as if my opinion didn't matter at all. I told her no one had asked me what I wanted, that it was my house, my space, my accomplishment. Emily looked at me with irritation, even a bit of disdain, and said I was selfish, that families help each other, that since I lived alone, there were plenty of spare rooms. That word selfish cut deep. Me, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her child, raised her alone after my husband Richard passed away. who always put others first, now being called selfish for simply wanting peace in my own home. Daniel tried to smooth things over, saying it would just be temporary, that they really needed help, that they still respected me. But I wasn't listening anymore. A wave of anger, sadness, and disappointment surged through me. I looked at my daughter, the baby I once held in my arms, the little girl I stayed up with through sleepless nights, and I couldn't recognize the woman sitting in front of me. When did she start thinking she had the right to decide my life for me? I quietly stood up and began clearing the table. Emily kept talking, saying I was overreacting, that I should think of the family, that helping them wasn't a big deal. But I stayed silent. Something inside me broke at that moment. After they left, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the boxes packed for moving day. And suddenly, they all felt meaningless. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring into the dark, wondering how things had come to this. When had my opinion stopped mattering? When had my daughter started seeing me as someone meant only to obey and never to be heard? At 6 a.m., the phone rang. It was the moving company calling to confirm the schedule. For a moment, I thought about canceling everything, giving up the house, giving up my dream. But then, the morning sunlight hit the golden set of keys on the table, the symbol of 40 years of work, sacrifice, and hope. And in that very instant, something inside me changed forever. It wasn't a logical decision, but a deep awakening within me. It felt like another Catherine was rising, the woman who had been asleep for years, who had forgotten she also had rights, that she deserved respect, and that she could say, no. I picked up the phone, strangely calm, and told the mover I'd call back later to confirm. I didn't cancel, but I didn't confirm either. For the first time in many years, I took time to think for myself. Sitting there, watching the sun rise over the Portland skyline as the city slowly woke up, I realized that this wasn't just moving day. It was the day I finally began deciding who I wanted to be for the rest of my life. And no one, absolutely no one, I had the right to decide that for me. Maybe you're wondering how I ended up here, a devoted mother treated as if her opinions meant nothing. The truth is, it began long before that fateful dinner. It started the day I became a widow when Richard, my husband, was killed in a car accident on his way to work, leaving me alone to raise Emily. She was only 22 at the time, freshly graduated with a degree in elementary education, and I knew I had to be strong for both of us. Richard left a small insurance payout, and we lived in a rented apartment on the outskirts of Salem, Oregon. Soon after, I found work as a floor supervisor at a textile factory. A demanding job with rotating shifts, but it paid steadily. For years, my life was a blur of early mornings and late nights, waking up at 5 a.m. for the first shift, or going to bed at 2 a.m. after the night shift. Even exhausted, I still cooked meals, asked about Emily's work, and tried to be both mother and father. When Emily graduated at 25, I cried through the entire ceremony until she laughed in embarrassment. They were tears of pride and joy. Not long after, Emily met Daniel at a staff gathering at her school. He was an electrical engineer, quiet, polite, seemingly hardworking. 2 years later, they got engaged. I helped however I could, took out a small loan, sold a few old things just to see my daughter happy. The wedding was simple but warm, held at a small church near downtown Portland. Watching Emily walk down the aisle in her white dress brought tears to my eyes. 2 years later, Emily was pregnant with Jacob, and I was overjoyed. Throughout her pregnancy, I went with her to doctor visits, helped decorate the nursery, cooked meals, and cared for her as if reliving my own youth. But after Jacob was born, I began to notice a change. Emily became overly protective, always finding reasons not to let me help, saying the baby was fussy, or sleeping, or I needed quiet. When she went back to work, I offered to babysit during the day so they could save on daycare costs, but her answer was a gentle yet firm no. I want to enroll Jacob in a professional childcare center. I tried not to be hurt, but a quiet ache grew inside me. It was as if my own daughter no longer trusted me to care for my grandchild. Still, I helped whenever I could, picking him up, watching him when they went out, always ready when they needed me. 3 years later, Lily was born. Once again, I was kept at a polite distance, allowed to visit, but never truly involved. Even so, I stayed patient and loving, buying gifts, offering money, being there whenever they called. That was my way of showing love, my way of reminding myself that I still belonged to the family. But during those years, my social life quietly disappeared. I had only work, my apartment, and my daughter's family. When friends invited me out, I always declined, saying I had to babysit or help Emily. My whole life revolved around being a mother and a grandmother, and when I finally retired at 59, I felt both relieved and empty, because for the first time in my life, I didn't know who I was living for. Emily suggested I travel, enjoy my retirement, but all I wanted was to stay close to family. I offered to help more with the kids, since I finally had free time to pick them up from school, help with homework, or watch them during vacations. But there was always a reason they didn't need me. The school had its own bus, their schedules were organized, and little by little, I realized my presence was tolerated, not desired. I was welcome on holidays, birthdays, and Christmas, but in everyday life, they went on without me, and I was just an observer. I felt like a decorative object in their lives, nice to have around, but without real purpose. That's when I decided to use my retirement savings to buy a small house of my own. If I wasn't essential to their lives anymore, at least I would have a place that truly belonged to me, a home where my voice mattered. But even during the process of buying the house, I kept putting Emily's and the kids' needs before my own. When Emily needed money for Lily's school tuition, I helped immediately. When she needed me to watch Jacob so she could go on a business trip, I canceled my own plans. I lived for other people's happiness, always hoping that one day they would see my love and sacrifices, that they would realize I wasn't just a weekend grandma, but the woman who had built the foundation of this entire family. For years, I never questioned it. I thought it was natural that mothers were meant to sacrifice, to stay in the background, to endure quietly. My identity had dissolved into the act of serving others. When people asked about me, I talked only about Emily, Daniel, Jacob, and Lily. I had become a shadow in my own life. And worse, I used to believe that was love. I called that self-erasure devotion, believing that the more I gave up, the more they'd love me. But the truth is, you only receive the kind of treatment you allow. For decades, I had been teaching my own daughter that my opinion didn't matter, that my feelings were secondary, that I should always give in for the sake of peace. For months, I visited that little yellow house every weekend. When I finally saved enough and made an offer, the owner accepted right away, saying he could feel how much I loved the house and that he was glad it would belong to someone who truly appreciated it. I signed the papers through tears of joy until that night, when everything changed forever. It was a night of clarity. For the first time in decades, I saw my life's pattern with painful precision. I canceled the transfer of my landline, and with every call I ended, I felt a strange sense of freedom, as if each small decision was helping me reclaim control over my life. When I called the moving company and said I no longer needed their services, I felt a power I hadn't felt in years, the power to choose. At 10 a.m., Emily called. I could hear the tension in her voice. She was probably checking in to coordinate moving day for her in-laws and Daniel's sister. When I told her I wasn't moving anymore, the other end went silent for about 10 seconds. Then she panicked. asking if I was sick or if something was wrong with the house. I calmly explained that nothing was wrong. I had simply decided not to move yet. Emily wouldn't accept it. She said Daniel's parents had already packed up, that Megan had given up her apartment. I told her I was sorry for them, but that it was my house and I would decide when or if I moved. Emily grew angry, accusing me of being selfish, saying families were supposed to help each other, that I couldn't just cancel everything at the last minute. But this time, I wasn't silent anymore. I said clearly, families help each other. Yes, but helping doesn't mean controlling. It doesn't mean making decisions for someone else without asking them. Then, I hung up. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from adrenaline, from a rush of strength I thought I'd lost long ago. 2 hours later, Emily showed up at my apartment with Daniel. One look at their faces told me they were here to pressure me. They sat in the living room, starting with that familiar mix of sweetness and insistence. Daniel talked about his parents' difficult situation, Linda and Robert, how they had sold their house to pay off medical bills. Emily added that Megan, Daniel's sister, had recently divorced and couldn't afford a place of her own. I listened to all of it, genuinely feeling sympathy. But when Daniel said I was the only one who could help, that I had a big house and would be living there alone, something inside me exploded. I stood up, I looked them both in the eyes, and said something I had never said in my entire life. You're confusing helping with taking advantage. I've worked for more than 40 years, saving every penny to buy my home. And you think you can just decide who gets to live there without even asking me? The room fell silent. Emily tried to argue, saying it was only temporary. I asked, temporary for how long? A month? 2 months? A year? Neither of them answered. That's when I realized the truth. They had no plan, no limit. They simply wanted to take advantage of my convenience. The home I had dreamed of, saved for, and built as my place of peace to them, it was nothing more than free family housing. Emily said I was getting older, that it would be good to have people living with me in case I needed help. Those words hit me like a slap in the face. Older? I was 64, in perfect health, sharp-minded, and had been working just a few years ago. I replied, when I replied, need help, I'll ask. And if the day comes when I can't take care of myself, I'll make the necessary arrangements. But I will not give up my independence just because of a future that hasn't even arrived. Emily started crying, saying she couldn't believe I would refuse to help family, that she was disappointed in me. For a moment, those tears shook me for years. I had done anything to keep her from crying, but this time was different. I saw clearly those weren't tears of pain, but of manipulation, the kind shed by someone used to getting what they want when reason no longer works. And for the first time in my life, I didn't give in. I told her I was sorry she was disappointed, but that I was too disappointed to realize that my opinion meant nothing in my own life. Disappointed that they saw me as someone who should just obey quietly. In that moment, looking at Emily and Daniel, I had a painful but freeing realization. Taught them not to respect me by always giving in, always putting them first, always swallowing my feelings to keep the peace. I had created that pattern, and if I had taught them not to respect me, then I could also teach them how to respect me. And that lesson began right then, with the very first and firmest no of my life. I told them both that my decision was final. I wasn't moving, and if I ever did, it would be on my own terms. They needed to find another solution for Daniel's parents and sister. Emily shot up from her chair, her face red with anger, accusing me of being selfish, of putting my comfort above the family's needs. Daniel tried to calm her down, but she was furious. Before storming out, Emily turned and said, "You're going to regret this decision, Mom. You'll regret choosing a house over your family." After they left, I sat alone in the apartment, feeling both relieved and sad relieved because I had finally stood up for myself, and sad because I realized my daughter could use tears to manipulate when she didn't get her way. But beneath it all, something new was growing inside me, a sense of self-respect and dignity that had been buried for years. For the first time in decades, I had defended my right to choose for myself. That evening, I called a small inn in downtown Salem, booked a room for 1 week not because I needed to leave my apartment, but because I needed time to think, to figure out the next step in my life. As I packed a few clothes into my suitcase, I looked in the mirror and saw a woman I hadn't recognized in years, a woman who had found her voice again, ready to discover who she truly was when she no longer lived for others. The reflection smiled at me, and I smiled back. The inn, where I stayed, was on a quiet street in Salem's historic district. It was simple yet cozy, filled with antique furniture and the comforting smell of coffee that reminded me of my childhood. Mrs. Thompson, the innkeeper, about 70 years old, greeted me with a warm smile and no intrusive questions. On my first day, I walked around the city of Salem, something I hadn't done in years. I wasn't rushing anywhere, had no plans, just observing people, shops, and the rhythm of life around me. During one of those walks, I stopped by a small bookstore on the corner of Liberty Street and bought 3 books I had always wanted to read but never had the time for. For the first time in decades, I bought something purely for myself, not because it was useful, not for anyone else, just for me. Every call was the same, starting with a fake tone of concern, turning into emotional pressure, and ending with accusations that I was selfish. I calmly listened, told her I was fine, and hung up. On the 4th day, I received a different kind of call. It was Linda, Emily's mother-in-law. Her voice was gentle and respectful, completely different from my daughter's. She said she had just learned what happened from Daniel, felt deeply embarrassed, and wanted to meet me in person. We agreed to meet at a small cafe on Court Street, near the inn. Linda arrived right on time with her husband, Robert. They both looked genuinely apologetic. Linda began by apologizing, saying they had no idea the arrangement had been made without my consent. Robert confirmed that they believed I was the one who had invited them to live with me. When I told them the full story, they were stunned and speechless. Linda shook her head and said they would never agree to live in a home where they weren't truly welcome. Robert added that they had always respected me as Emily's mother and felt offended to find out how things had unfolded. That conversation opened my eyes to many things. For 2 full hours, we talked about family, respect, and boundaries. Linda shared that she had gone through something similar with her own mother-in-law and had learned that every family relationship must be built on mutual respect, not obligation. When we said goodbye, Linda hugged me and said something I will never forget. "Catherine, you were absolutely right to protect your home and your peace. If my child ever treated me the way your daughter did, I hope I'd have the courage to do what you did." I returned to the inn that afternoon with a lighter heart. For the first time since everything began, someone had truly listened, understood, and supported me. And what moved me most, it wasn't my child or my grandchildren, but 2 people who were almost strangers, who, in just 2 hours, gave me the respect I hadn't received in years. At breakfast on the 6th day, Mrs. Thompson, the innkeeper, sat down at my table. She had noticed that I wasn't just another guest, that something deeper was keeping me there. With the gentle wisdom of someone who had seen life's changes, she started a conversation about transitions and new beginnings. I ended up telling her my whole story. She listened without judgment, nodding softly at certain moments. When I finished, she sighed and said she had known many women in situations like my mother's who had sacrificed so much they'd forgotten themselves. She told me about a former guest from Denver, a woman who had sold her house to pay off her son's debts, only to hear years later that he couldn't take her in when she needed a place to stay. In the end, that woman became homeless. Mrs. Thompson looked at me and said something I will never forget. "Catherine, kindness without limits turns into exploitation. You were right to say no." That conversation gave me the courage to do what I had been avoiding, to visit my new house, to truly see if it could be the home for the next chapter of my life. The house was exactly as I remembered, warm, full of light and hope. This time, I noticed the spadifation, small details. The low white fence that made it easy to talk with neighbors, the wide porch, perfect for welcoming guests, and the peaceful garden, the perfect place for a woman ready to live life on her own terms. While I was in the backyard, a man around 67 years old with silver hair and a kind smile greeted me over the fence. His name was John. My neighbor to the right, a widower for 5 years, retired from the power company, with 2 grown children living in Seattle. We talked for nearly an hour across the fence. He told me about the neighborhood, the people who lived nearby, and the simple joys of quiet living. When I mentioned that I was staying at an inn while thinking through some family matters, John just smiled and said, "Everyone needs time and space to make an important decision. I'd be happy to have a neighbor like you. You seem like someone kind and sensible." That afternoon, I returned with a certainty I had never felt before. I wanted to live in that house, not to run away, not out of anger, but because it represented a life that truly belonged to me. That night, I called Emily. I told her I had made my final decision. I would move in and live there alone, and that she and Daniel would need to find another solution for his parents and sister. I made it clear I wasn't refusing to help. I was simply setting boundaries. My house would be mine. Emily's reaction exploded like a storm. She screamed that I was crazy, that I was tearing the family apart over stubbornness, that I'd regret it when I was old and lonely. Each word stung, but none of it shook me anymore. I replied calmly, "I'm sorry you see my wish for independence as rebellion. My home will always be open to you and the kids, but on my terms. When you want to visit, I'll welcome you, but I will not give up the right to live life my own way. My life. Emily, I love you too much to keep letting you disrespect me. Real love must come with respect. When you're ready to treat me with respect, we'll talk again." The next day, I rescheduled the move. I called back every service I had canceled, picked out new furniture, decorated each room exactly how I liked, putting my own comfort and happiness at the center. While I was preparing, I got an unexpected call. It was Linda. She said she had a serious talk with Emily and Daniel, explaining how disrespectful the whole situation had been. She added that the couple had rented a small apartment, just enough for them, and thanked me for allowing them to resolve everything with dignity. Linda ended the call by saying, "I hope Emily grows up and learns to appreciate you. A mother like you deserves respect and admiration, not pressure or control." Imagined. It wasn't just a move, it was a turning point in my life, a change in how I saw myself. On the first morning, I sat on the porch, drinking hot coffee, listening to the birds, and watching John, my neighbor, tending his garden across the fence. He waved, smiled, and called out, "Good morning, neighbor. How was your first night here?" I smiled back and said, "Perfect, John. Absolutely perfect." And it was true. For the first time in decades, I had a night that truly belonged to me. The first 3 months in the new house became a journey of discovery, discovering who I was when I no longer lived for others, rediscovering the small joys I had forgotten, and awakening a stronger Catherine who had been asleep for far too long. My mornings became a sacred ritual. I woke up at 6 a.m., brewed my coffee, and took my book to the porch. Sitting there, watching the street come to life, listening to the birds, and feeling the morning breeze, I found a peace I had never known before. John always waved from his garden across the fence, Sometimes we exchanged a few friendly words, but he always respected my quiet, a simple but precious kind of respect, just like the new life I had rediscovered. One morning, the doorbell rang at 8 a.m. I opened the door and saw Jacob and Lily, my grandchildren, wearing backpacks and standing shyly. Jacob, the older one, spoke first. "Grandma, we came to visit you. Mom doesn't know we're here." My heart nearly stopped. I quickly ushered them inside, made breakfast, and gently asked how they'd gotten there. Lily explained that they had taken 2 buses, that Jacob had used his allowance to buy the tickets, and that they missed me so much. While I made them sandwiches, I called Emily. She panicked, saying she'd been searching for the kids everywhere. When I told her they were with me, her tone instantly turned angry. She said I had no right to keep her children from her, and that she was coming to get them immediately. I calmly replied that I hadn't hidden anyone, they had come on their own, but made it clear that if she wanted to come, she needed to do so with respect, without yelling or making a scene in front of the kids. An hour later, Emily and Daniel showed up. One look at their faces, and I knew they were ready for confrontation. But when they saw the kids playing in the garden, eating cookies, laughing, and telling stories about school, their expressions softened. Jacob ran up to hug his dad and asked, "Dad, why can't Grandma come to our house anymore? Why can't we visit her?" Emily tried to explain that grown-up things can be complicated, but Lily, with the honesty only a child has, said, "Mom, Grandma didn't do anything wrong. She just wants to live alone in her own house. What's wrong with that?" At that moment, I saw Daniel place his hand on Emily's shoulder, as if to say, "The kids are right." And right then, for the first time in months, Emily looked me in the eyes without anger. She said she wanted to talk privately in the kitchen. For 15 minutes, her tone was completely different. She told me she'd been talking a lot with Linda, her mother-in-law, over the past few days, and had begun to realize she was wrong. Then she said something that brought tears to my eyes. "Mom, I don't know when I started thinking you had to do everything I wanted. I don't know when I stopped asking for your opinion and just started telling you my decisions." That confession, coming from my grown daughter, felt like a healing balm for my heart. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the first sign that she wanted to understand me. I told her that we could rebuild our relationship, but only on a new foundation, that I was no longer the mother who stayed silent to keep the peace, that I had learned the value of the word no, and that I wouldn't hesitate to use it again. Daniel added that he had also reflected on everything, realized how disrespectful they'd been, and offered a sincere apology. The kids stayed with me until the afternoon. I showed them around the house, told them how I decorated each corner, and let them pick their own rooms for future visits. The happiness in their eyes when they realized they still had Grandma's house to come back to almost made me cry. When Emily returned to pick them up, we agreed that the kids could visit me every Saturday. She accepted, but added that I should also come visit her house sometimes. I agreed, but made it clear those visits would be by choice, not obligation. 2 weeks later, I had another unexpected visitor, Linda, this time not to talk about family, but to invite me to lunch at the new apartment she and Robert had moved into. She said she wanted to show me their place and keep in touch, as friends. Their apartment was small, but cozy. Linda had decorated it beautifully, while Robert proudly showed off a small woodworking space he had set up in the laundry area, where he made handcrafted pieces. That afternoon, we didn't talk about Emily. We talked about life, about the trips they wanted to take, and about the grandchildren they hoped to see more often. Robert mentioned he was taking a class on restoring antique furniture, and Linda said they were finally enjoying what it meant to live for themselves. And as I listened, I smiled, realizing I was doing the same. When I left, Linda hugged me and said, "Catherine, thank you for teaching us that saying no can be something to be proud of." You've given us a lesson in self-respect we'll never forget. After that, I started joining the seniors group at St. Mary's Church in Salem, hoping to meet, share, and connect with people my age. There, I met Irene, a 66-year-old retired teacher who had gone through a very similar experience. Irene told me that her children once tried to sell her house and split the money, claiming she was too old to live alone. She took them to court, proved she was perfectly healthy and clear-minded, and cut off contact for 2 years until they learned how to respect her. One day, during a group chat, Irene told me something I'll never forget. Catherine, all our lives we teach people how to treat us. If we accept disrespect, they'll never stop giving it. If you demand respect, others will learn to give it. Thanks to the church seniors group, I started volunteering at Oakview Nursing Home, about a 20-minute drive from my house. Every week, I went there to talk with residents who had no visitors, help them join small activities, and read books to those with weak eyesight. That work gave me a new perspective on my own life. I met women who had been abandoned by their children, who hadn't had a single visitor in years. I met men who had given everything to their kids, only to find themselves left with nothing but loneliness in old age. Compared to them, my story was nothing yet there. I also found stories that inspired me. There was Clara, 82 years old, who sold all her belongings at 70 to travel across the United States before voluntarily moving into the nursing home. And George, 78, who painted beautiful pictures and said he didn't discover his artistic talent until he was 65. Volunteering helped me rediscover the sense of purpose I had lost long ago. I was no longer just someone's mother or grandmother. I was Catherine, a woman with her own worth, her own life experience to share, and something valuable to give back to the community. 6 months after moving into my home, I hosted a small gathering. I invited John, Mrs. Thompson from the inn, Linda and Robert, a few friends from the church, seniors group, and of course Emily, Daniel, and my grandchildren, Jacob and Lily. It was a beautiful afternoon, laughter filling the house, genuine conversations, and a warmth that felt real. The kids played in the garden while the adults talked on the porch, and for the first time in decades, I felt like the true owner of my own life. I saw Emily chatting with Linda, the two speaking to each other with mutual respect. While Daniel helped John tend the plants in the garden, they laughed together like old friends. My home had become a gathering place, but this time, on my terms. When everyone left, Emily stayed behind to help me clean the kitchen. As she washed the dishes, she said something that touched my heart. "Mom, I've never seen you this happy and complete. Maybe I never really understood what you needed." I smiled and said, "I didn't know what I needed either until I started fighting for it. When I learned to set my boundaries, I also found my true strength inside." That night, after everyone I had gone, I sat alone on the porch with a cup of hot tea, staring at the starry sky. A few months earlier, I had been living temporarily at an inn, unsure what my future would be. Now, I was in my own home, surrounded by people who respected me, living a life that truly belonged to me. The phone rang. It was Jacob, my grandson, calling to thank me for the party. He said he loved how my house was full of laughter and that he was proud to have such a strong and independent grandmother. Before hanging up, he said, "Grandma, you're really brave." Because it takes a lot of courage to live for yourself after a lifetime of living for others. These days, when I share my story, people sometimes ask, "Do you regret being so firm with your daughter? Weren't you afraid of losing your family over a house?" I always answer, I didn't fight for a house. I fought for the right to be respected as a person. The house was only a symbol. What I truly protected was my dignity, my independence, and my right to choose how I want to live. And I learned that no one gives you that right. You have to claim it for yourself. The silence I chose that day, when I canceled the move, was the most powerful silence of my life. The silence of a woman who had finally found her own voice. And by finding that voice, I not only changed my life, I inspired those around me. At 64, I can say I'm living the best version of myself, not because I have a beautiful house or because my family is at peace, but because I've learned it's never too late to demand the respect you deserve. It's never too late to choose happiness for yourself. Catherine's story is a work of fiction inspired by real experiences, with names and places changed to protect privacy. But the emotions, the pain of being dismissed, and the power of saying no are ones many of us have felt. Maybe we've all stood at that same crossroads between staying silent to keep the peace and speaking up to protect our dignity. Which would you choose if you were Catherine in that moment? In the end, she found peace not in the house itself, but in her faith that God gives us the courage to live truthfully. Thank you for watching today's story. Stay with us. 2 videos waiting on your screen might touch your heart in ways you never expected.